duality is both real and provisional, right? It is real because it is genuinely shaping how we see things around us, right? But it is provisional because if we go into the nitty-gritties of it, right? In physics, we have different forces of nature. We say that may have a unified force at the very beginning, let's say, right? So clearly there are different branches or different offshoots of the very same force, or that is the idea at least. I would say that the most sophisticated understanding of duality is that it is all about relationships, not about distinctions, right? And sometimes these relationships are more fundamental than that between which there is a relationship. The whole idea of composition and transcending at the same time, right? So we are almost talking about a meta-duality, right? Duality that goes beyond just the very simple instance of duality as we
Vedic deities
like
as well. Agni, we consider it as a phenomena.
Exactly, but it is transcending that.
Namaste. Welcome to another episode of Physics from the Point of View of IKS on Sangam Talks. We have with us Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar. Namaste, sir. Thank you for coming again.
Thank you.
So we started this series that's on physics, but from the point of view of Indian knowledge system, and we are in the 5th episode now. Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar ji, he have acumen in advanced physics. He is an assistant professor in Amrit Vishya Vidyapeetham and an adjunct professor from National Institute of Advanced Studies. He had done his PhD from Cambridge University and postdoctoral researches from Harvard University under Nobel laureate, and he had done researches on advanced physics like quantum mechanical theories. So he had a great profound acumen on this subject. So today we will talk about the duality and reality. Sir, welcome again.
Thank you.
So I'll start my question with, how do we define that duality? It is scientific, philosophical, existential, or cultural construct, or all them together?
Thank you, Debasis, for that question, and that's a very, very important question as it stands. Duality is everywhere around us, but it is not often the way we think it is, essentially. We see duality as opposites sometimes. Many a times we have looked at the hot versus cold, this versus that, us versus them, right? These are all different kinds of dual aspects of how society or the universe is kind of oriented, essentially. But when we look at our scientific wisdom, the modern scientific wisdom, as well as the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, duality is not always seen as a play of opposites, but rather it is seen as an interplay of complementary aspects. So if we talk about physics itself, we have spoken in the past in one of our episodes about the duality principle in quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, the duality aspect comes in from light, essentially the study of light. And that has a historical trajectory that encompassed everybody from Newton's work, where he talked about the corpuscular model of light itself. We had Young's double slit experiment, for instance, Physio and various others who had worked on that front. Huygens, we had talked about Huygens as well. So these all aspects showed that light has both a wave-like and a particle-like aspect to it. And it was very interesting because it was not only light, but also matter in general was seen to have both the dual aspect of waveness as well as particleness. Recently, it has been found that in the Stevens Institute of Technology, which is in New Jersey in the US, they have found that this duality of particleness and waveness actually comes from this element of coherence, right? Quantum coherence, as it is called. And that is what mediates these two aspects of nature, right? Not only in entities, not only in particles, but also in processes. Recently, we have seen that duality emerges in certain kinds of contexts. So, for instance, in the Large Hadron Collider, which is in CERN, which became famous because of the God particle, right? The finding of the God particle. There, they have seen that there is a certain duality between two different processes. The process basically has, in one of the processes, you have two gluons. Gluons are these very, very subatomic mediators of force, essentially. When we talk about the constituents of protons and neutrons, quarks, right? The things that mediate between them, they are called gluons, essentially. So if you have two gluons and they move to create four, let's say, right? Or those two gluons lead to one Higgs boson and some other gluons, these two processes are found to be dual in nature. Right? So it's very interesting because now we are not talking about entities alone, but we're talking about the processes as well. Right? So in Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, we have had the aspect of duality for quite some time. And here we have always looked at it not in terms of laboratories in which light is studied per se, but more in terms of internal explorations of consciousness, so to say. So for instance, to give you a context, we can talk about the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, and in that shlok 4.22, which says, Yadricha labha santushto dvandvatito vimatsarah samah siddhava asiddho cha kritvapi na nibhadyate. Which means that he who is satisfied with gain which comes of its own accord, who is free from duality and does not envy, who is steady in both success and failure, is never entangled even though performing actions. Right? So if we go forward from the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, there are various other Maharishis, Maharishi Yajnavalkya, Maharishi Ribhu, for instance. They have shown us that there is a distinction between this idea of I, right? This I am doing something, for instance. When I say I am angry, right? Or I do not like this, right? What we inherently do is we try to create a difference, a distinction between ourselves as individuals and what we are focused on, right? What we are reacting towards, for instance, right? And in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, we have seen that these two things may not be all that distinct in themselves, right? There may be something underlying them, which is actually more unifying in certain ways, right? Now, one very interesting story comes from the Laghu Yoga Vasishtha, right, by Maharshi Valmiki, and when we talk about the Ramayana, right, that comes to the fore, and we have chapter 6, part 9, which talks about King Shikidhwaja. And so King Shikidhwaja was somebody who renounced his, the pleasures of life, the luxuries that he had, in the move towards going towards realization, essentially, right? But it was found that he actually could not let go of many of the things. I mean, there were certain desires, certain aspects that still remained. And his wife, by the name of Chudala, she realized this aspect, right? She realized this in a certain way, and she saw that he's kind of very superficially trying to get rid of things in a certain way, just because he may have heard about it or he may have seen it somewhere, and he's just trying to replicate that, right? So she then took the form of Kumbha Muni.
So she is an elevated soul.
Yes, so she had realization, she was a realized person in herself, and she realized where the problem was with Shikidhwaja, and she took the form of Kumbha Muni, and she came forward and made him understand that, just at a superficial level, right, letting go of these aspects is not going to be good enough for, austerity, or you can say realization necessarily. And it's all about letting go of the inner turmoil or the inner kind of attachment, so to say, right? And so then she also took another form, which is of a lady by the name of Madanika, and to kind of entice him and just to test him that has he really understood what is being said, right? And she found to her, great joy that he actually had turned a leaf, right? So in fact, yes,
tangent,
yeah,
like she didn't, give away her feminine,
right,
perspective,
yes,
but still, in today's world, when you talk about the Brahminical patriarchy,
right,
people should know about these things, that how
yes,
feminine power has been idealized.
I will say that, later on we will discuss about this when we talk about Shiv Shakti, when we talk about Purush Prakriti. There are so many aspects where the divine feminine has a very important role to play, essentially, right? So, just to kind of go back to the story itself,
yes,
right? So in the Yoga Vasishtha, in verse 6.108.31, it is said that, this test that Chudala had done, there's a shlok that comes from it, which says that Sri Vasishtha Uvacha, which basically means that Sri Vasishtha says, right? Evam samtaya tatra sthite tasmin chikidhvaje chudala chintaya masa tatsat vinodashaya, right? Which means that Vasishtha replies, right, after Shikidhwaja had consented to continue his indifference and disinterested friendship with his only companion in the forest, Chudala was highly pleased to note the nobleness of his mind, right? So that change had finally happened, essentially, right? Now, if we turn to modern neuroscience, right, this idea of what is the self, right? What is the self? Because we always, so in Shikidhwaja's case, he didn't understand that letting go of attachments by the self is not at the superficial level. It is not at the level of empiricism. It is a much more foundational, much more fundamental letting go, as they call it, right? So in the same way, when we talk about neuroscience today, we see that the idea of self, the self, right? It has to do with certain specific kinds of brain activities, right? And there has been a recent study which said that it has to relate with connectomics. Connectomics is a new area of study which looks at how functional networks come about in these kinds of neural structures or architectures, right? And there was a recent study in NPJ Mental Health, which is a very well-known kind of journal, and it says that people, when they had tried to do different kinds of control experiments with yoga, for instance, Sudarshan Kriya Yoga, there were certain kinds of brain activities that were found to kind of have a little bit of different behavior, essentially, right? So they had done the study with electroencephalography, which is EEG, as we call it, and they found that different components of the technique influenced the brain activity. The main findings were that the relaxed meditative state has only these theta and delta rhythms that are part of it. It also reduces the alpha power, and there is a decrease in the non-repeating brain signals, which is also called the aperiodic activity, essentially, right? So now you will ask that is this saying to us that the self has been curtailed, has been controlled? Not quite, right? Because what this is saying is that it is controlling those aspects which define a certain level of your self, essentially, right? It is kind of the mental processes that has temporarily been stopped or altered in certain ways, right? So we also see that whenever we are talking about the self, when we are absorbed in something, right? We like it a lot. हमें कुछ बहुत अच्छा लग रहा है. We say that start identifying with that thing which we are relating to, right? We become almost, that becomes a part of us, essentially, right? So the way we understand experience and mental processes, right? There's a lot of rigor in the way the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara talks about it, and also the neuroscientific side also has been speaking about it. Now, when we talk about the mathematics, right, when we talk about information theory, we say that this is an age of information, that it's a data age, all about data, right? So data is structured on duality, right? Data is structured on this idea of bits, zeros and ones, for instance, right? So if you have, let's say, n bits, right, they can encode 2 to the power n different kinds of instances of digital complexity, right? So without this kind of distinction, right, it would not have been possible to have this entire architecture of information theory, right? And the duality is both in that case absolutely necessary, and it is also a tool to understand the information theoretics, right? Now, even in biology, if we talk about biology, duality comes in many different areas. So, for instance, if you talk about digestive systems, right? In digestive systems, we have if you talk about it in this context of the cell membrane or the intestinal lining, right? It is not, it has a lot of exchange of matter or components, right? So you have, for instance, the food, how it is metabolizing. When you say glucose is being entering the system via what is called as SGLT1, yeah, there are certain other GLUT2, for instance. It has to be selectively brought into the system, right? And those things that are not required have to selectively be brought out as waste, essentially, right? So there's a very selective way in which this mediation of that boundary, right, the flux across that boundary is undertaken. Then if you talk about the defensive system, the immune system of our body, there are many kinds of bacteria in our digestive system which are actually required, right? Gut bacteria, as it is called, right? So the point is, when we say us versus them, right? You and not you, right? Is your gut bacteria part of you? It's not, right? Now, is the body's immune system supposed to chuck out all that is not you? In a way, yes. Right? But does it do for the gut bacteria? It does not, right? So why does it not? So that is a fundamental question, right? So it uses things like barriers, it uses IgA antibodies, it uses regulatory T cells. There are a lot of different techniques, right? T cells.
T cells is therefore to distinguish.
Right. So the distinction, right? So we see that in this context, in biology, the division between you and not you, right? And these dualities are much more carefully mediated and negotiated as we go along, right? So this is a very important point that I would like to highlight. And one metaphysical thought, or one thought that comes to mind, is duality emerges when a system is sufficiently complex to refer to itself, right? Because as soon as you try to refer to yourself, and this is thinkers like Husserl and Sartre have spoken about it, that is when you bring in this aspect of you versus not you of sorts, right? You define what is you in the first place, right? So there's a very well-known book, Metzinger's book, which is called Being No One, right? This was published by the MIT Press, right? And they say that the self is a phenomenal self model. It's a representation, right? And you can only represent if you have sufficient degree of complexity in your mind, in the way you intellectually represent yourself, right? So this is a very seminal book, and this has been kind of going on for a while. Now, in Indian knowledge systems and Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, we talk about Maya, right? So this idea is that if you are all part of the same underlying reality, right? Brahman, for instance, or there are other ways of talking about it, Paramashiva in Trika Shaivism, then why do we see the multiplicity that we see, right? Why do we see so much of diversity, so much of distinctions, essentially? So the idea there is that there is an element of Maya, right? The element of Maya is what brings in these distinctions, so to say. And in the Mandukya Karika, for instance, there is a well-known verse 2.19 which says pranadhi bharanantascha bhavera etera vikalpitaha maesha tasya devasya yaya samohita swayam, right? Which means the Atman is imagined as prana and other endless objects. This is due to Maya or ignorance of the luminous Atman within oneself, by which it is, as it were, deluded. So this idea of delusion, right? What it is not, but what you think it is, right? This idea is very, very important in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. And so all of these examples show you that duality is both real and provisional, right? It is real because it is genuinely shaping how we see things around us, right? But it is provisional because if we go into the nitty-gritties of it, right? In physics, we have different forces of nature. We say that may have a unified force at the very beginning, let's say, right? So clearly there are different branches or different offshoots of the very same force, or that is the idea at least, right? So understanding this actually helps us a lot, because then we start thinking in terms of complementarity. We start thinking about things as coming together, cohesion, coordination, right? Not us versus them, this opposite ideas of opposites, right? And I always say that duality is the creative principle by which unity expresses itself in the worldly sense, in the universal aspect of things. And we have to be respectful of it. We have to be respectful of it, essentially. We cannot think of it as a mistake that has to be fixed, right? So when we talk about diversity, it has to be respecting that and working with that in a certain way.
Like Indians are essentially very comfortable with this idea, duality.
Right. Yes.
And that's why maybe we are not that much suffering in today's world.
Well, I mean, I think any extreme leads to suffering, right? I mean, as you say, even when you're consuming any element in your body, right, or in general, the toxic nature comes out when there is an excess, right? Either ways, anyways. So I think one has to be very careful how you define dualities and multiplicities in that sense. Yeah.
Right. So can duality exist without the concept of opposites?
Right.
Like the contemporarity paradox or simultaneity.
Right. So I think that is a very important question, and as you just mentioned, in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara and in physics and science, duality is no longer looked at as a conflict of sorts. It's not looked at as a play of opposites, and it should not be, right? Because in physics, for instance, you have something called as complementarity, in which the idea is that there are certain kinds of variables, right, which do not have simultaneous certainty up to the ultimate point, right? So if you're talking about position and momentum, right? Energy and time, right? These two, when they are simultaneously measured, the precision with which they can be measured is constrained. They cannot be done simultaneously, right? So now you may ask, which is the correct way to characterize a system, right? Is it one or the other, right? The answer is that both, essentially, right? The answer is that both of these complementary aspects have to be brought together to give us a comprehensive overview of what the system actually is, right? So if you say that, there is a duality and there is a fuzziness, right, of separates of different distinct variables, that is not the answer that will describe nature in its entirety, right? Now, even for instance, our eyes, right, the way our eyes work, there's a left and the right eye, right? And it's a wonder of nature, right? The way they coordinate with respect to each other. So for instance, in technical terms, if you talk about the slight disparity, right, between the retinal images of each eye, which is called as binocular disparity, that is integrated by the visual cortex to compute what is known as the stereoscopic depth, right? So when that is integrated in a specific way, then it goes beyond what a monocular or one eye could have described that same object as, essentially, right? So again, complementarity comes into the picture. Now in Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, we have had this concept of Dvandvatita, which basically means beyond opposites, right? In Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, for instance, we have Shiv Shakti. We have these opposing ideas, I wouldn't say, because they are never quite opposing ideas in that sense, right? People later on, even today's age, we talk about these poles or these different elements or aspects, but that is not how it was described. That is not how we should be looking at it. So in a different context, in the Saundarya Lahiri, for instance, we find a very beautiful shlok with which Saundarya Lahiri is begun. That's the shlok, the first shlok of Saundarya Lahiri, where it says, Shiva Shaktya yukto yadi bhavati shaktaha prabhavitum na chedevim devo na khalu kushalaha spanditum api atah tvam aradhyam harihara virinchadhibhiri api prananturum stotam va katham akrita punyaha prabhavati, right? Which means Shiva becomes capable of creation only when united with Shakti. Without her, even the great Lord is not able to stir, right? You are indeed worthy of worship even by Hari, Vishnu, Hara or Shiva, and Birinchi, which is a very interesting name, which is Lord Brahma's name, which people don't talk about all that much. How then can someone of little merit hope to praise or even bow to you? Right? So this idea of this duality working together, and without that, even Mahadev, right, Lord Shiva, cannot possibly do the various things in many different ways, right, is the first shloka of the Saundarya Lahiri, right? So you can see the importance it is being given. I mean, in Trika Shaivism, in Shakta worship, in various strands, Devi Mahatmayam, right, for instance. So you see this coming through in those areas. Now, duality can also be seen in two other concepts, which is that of paradox, right? So if I say, this sentence is false, right? This sentence is false. We have, I think, discussed this a little back in time as well. Then what is it? What is the truth of this?
At
right?
the same time,
Because if it is true, then it is false, and if it is false, then this is true, right? So there is a degree of self-reference that keeps on occurring in this kind of a construction, and this is what is called as a paradox, right? Now, you also have something called simultaneity, simultaneous things, right? So for instance, I could say that I love that person and I'm very frustrated with them, right? People often say that, right? At the same time, right? In this certain job, for instance, I'm finding a lot of fulfillment, but I'm also deeply kind of antagonized by XYZ things, right? It's not that it's exhaustive or exclusive from each other. They are coming together in a simultaneous manner to give us the complete picture of what you think of it, right? So if you take one in its absolute sense, right, it doesn't quite characterize what you are meaning of it, essentially, right?
And both so at the same time,
absolutely
you're thinking the same thing, that
right,
it's healthy,
right? And your mind does think of a number of different things together, right? It's not usually isolated aspects which are posited or processed in that way, right? Now when we talk about inhalation and exhalation, right, simple biological process, right, the duality between these two creates the rhythm of life. And we have seen that when we are doing vipassana, when we are doing meditation, when we are doing certain kinds of these mindful breathing exercises, there is an aspect of the pause in between the inhalation and exhalation, which is also called apnea, right? And that we have seen in various kinds of studies that pause is associated with enhanced interoceptive awareness and the transient stabilization of these networks of attention, right? How attention comes into the picture. And neuroimaging has shown that these pauses engage what we call as a prefrontal cortex and the insula in our body. And that is what helps us in conscious awareness and self-monitoring, right? So functionally, this is what we call as a meta-stable state, right? It is neither stable nor unstable in its entirety. But these meta-stable or meta-stability is often important when we're talking about systems where there are two different binaries, let's say, right? Two different states, right? So when people say, yeah, stable hai ya unstable hai, I think the answer sometimes is in somewhere in the middle, right? And in this case also we see that that indeed is the case. Now modern physics, right? When we talk about modern physics, we have a number of different places where dualities have come in. We have, and they are complementary again. So for instance, electricity and magnetism we have spoken about. They are part of the same kind of electromagnetic force of sorts. Space and time is part of space-time now, for instance. Then you have matter and energy, the equivalence principle. But if we move a little forward, we have different formulations of the fundamental forces spoken of in terms of symmetry breaking, for instance, right? Or even the gauge symmetry, the idea of gauge symmetries or gauge fields, right? They give us a better understanding of how to describe these forces, and there is a certain degree of redundancy when we talk about gauge symmetries. In string theory, for instance, and various other theories, you have dualities like T-duality, which talks about whether there is a spatial dimension that is small or that is large, right? You talk about S-duality, which talks about how the systems couple with respect to each other, right? Do they couple very strongly or in a certain weaker way? Particles and antiparticles, right? We often talk about CPT symmetry and certain other kinds of symmetries, how these dualities are negotiated, how they are kind of mediated essentially. That is, these are all very integral parts of modern physics, as we call it, right? So each duality is kind of reflecting a deeper unity, so to say, right? All these 5-6 instances that we have. Now, this is also looked at in art, for instance, right? When we listen to a raga, right? Bhimsen Joshi ji, for instance, right? And various others who have been proponents of raga. Now, there is a certain melodic framework, right? Which is obviously the series of certain notes, certain kind of elements, essentially. But oftentimes it is about the interpretive aspect, the subjective aspect that brings in a life into it, essentially, right? So, you know, Malhar, for instance, or Bhairava, right? There are different elements and different times of the day when we, you know, sing it as well. And so these improvisations and ornamentations, right? The alap, you know, the little, you know, lays and various other kind of small little innovations that you do, right? They add a life of their own to it, essentially, right? So this duality of what is structured and what is not structured, what is improvised and what is not, what is fundamental, this itself is a very kind of blurred kind of aspect in art and in music, for that matter, right? When we talk about language, right? In language, we have different kinds of semantic and structural systems, right? So there is something known as paradigmatic and syntagmatic networks of language. So for instance, if I say red, right, and blue or green, there are certain ways in which the distinction is a fine-grained semantic differentiation, right? So in a way, the semantic values are dependent on these differential values, so to say, and the differential relations between different elements of language, right? And so this systematic interplay of this lexical and the semantic, you know, how that leads to a precision in the communicative expressions, right? That is very, very important in language itself. Again, there are ways in which, and when we go forward, we'll see that different languages have different ways to kind of talk about these distinctions, these interplays, so to say, right? Now, in mathematics, for instance, dualities have a lot of role to play. I mean, you talk about vectors, right? Vector spaces. Vector spaces have things called as dual vectors, right? Dual vectors and vectors together, they describe all of the mathematical structure of that particular system. In geometry, points and lines, for instance, can be swapped in certain kinds of projective planes and in the context of some theorems, right? Fourier transforms, Fourier series, right? We have this aspect of the position going to the frequency domain and frequency coming back to in the inverse Fourier transform. In category theory, for instance, you can also talk about a dual category, right? Where some relations, which are called morphisms, their direction can be reversed, right? So they together describe the mathematical structure that we see, right? So even in that, you see a lot of element of duality that comes into the picture. Now, in biological systems, going back, in the nervous system, we were talking about immune systems and digestion systems. Now, in nervous systems, we have something known as the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches of the body, right? So there is this thing that we often hear about, which is that of fight or flight, right? Fight or flight, right? When you're seeing a danger, do you confront it or you do run, right? So sympathetic kind of branch of the nervous system deals with that, right? It kind of, you will see that your heart rate kind of starts pumping up, right? You have a different kind of response behavior. Parasympathetic, on the other hand, is something where you talk about rest and digest, right? Rest and digest state is by the parasympathetic branch. So in that, obviously, you have more of a resting kind of state of being, essentially, and it's a very different way in which the body responds. And together, these two different branches, comprehensively kind of look at different kinds of stimuli and how the body reacts to it, right? Again, the dualities between those two branches and how they work together, how they coordinate, right, is a very interesting thing in itself, right? I would say that the most sophisticated understanding of duality is that it is all about relationships, not about distinctions, right? And sometimes these relationships are more fundamental than that between which there is a relationship, so to say, right? And now, for instance, in market economics, right, we talk about regularization and monitoring and decentralized markets, right? Free market, right? Now, both of them have some problems in themselves, right? So obviously the free market system does lead to competitiveness, efficiency in many ways, but it also can lead to the creation of monopolies, right? There are certain kinds of asymmetric growth patterns that can also come about. Regulation as an end in itself, right, can also create problems in terms of how you allocate resources. There are some inequities that can be also there in such systems. Today, we are talking about the age of AI, for instance, right? So there's a lot of discussion about how AI can make a difference in this, and, how do you deal with that, right? Because AI, what is very interesting is this regulation and non-regulation, right? What is free and what is not free. AI kind of makes it much more fluid in a way, right? Because it is much more adaptive. Right? So as soon as you make a category and not a category, right, there are ways in which it can kind of go, not quite go into the interstices, that's not the right way to put it, but there are certain other paradigms or certain other ways of creating things or understanding things which the initial point may not have thought about, right? So now what has happened is, recently I was reading a study, I think IMF was also involved in that, the world of AI and how you look at this post-market surveillance, right? How is the consumer addressed, their concerns are addressed by the producers, by the sellers, right? So now they're talking about something called as product liability, right, which we know about. And so they do not predefine the nature of how that surveillance or what kind of changes may happen, but they talk about the liability aspect of things as in terms of what is assessed as liability that the person owes to the consumer, so to say, right? So the way in which dualities or the constructs, these binaries, right, are placed in market economics now in the world of AI is also evolving in many ways, and it is becoming much more fluidic in certain ways as well, right? So I would like to end this particular segment by saying I sometimes think that non-oppositional duality, right, non-oppositional, whether you don't have an opposition of sorts, is actually more fundamental than oppositional non-duality, right? What do I mean by that? So non-oppositional duality means you have a duality which you use in a provisional manner, right? You see the differences and you work with it in certain ways. Oppositional non-duality means the politics of exclusivism, right? When you say non-duality, matlab, there is a God, for instance, right? There is an idea of truth, for instance, right? These monoliths of faith and what you think is truth, right? Half the problem, or more than half the problems of today's world, right, are because of standing strong with what you think is the truth.
Yes, dogmatic.
Right? Dogmatic, right? So I would say this is a very interesting aspect which I was thinking about a few days back, that non-oppositional duality is not as harmful, right? Or is probably even more fundamental in certain ways than oppositional non-duality, which is a facade, which is not quite the truth of the matter, right? Because if you were truly non-dual, then there is no aspect of oppositionality that you can have, right? So it is a hypocrisy, it is an inconsistency that is something we see in today's age, right? So we should not mistake distinctions for divisions, right? And we have to work with these other more coordinated, more complementary ways to understand duality as.
Maybe only in Indian civilization, our God even changed themselves in different eras.
Absolutely.
In different
Absolutely. Right, and so the idea of how you relate with God, right, and in what age, what era, yuga, right, you have which form of divinity that comes to be is very contextual.
Yes.
Right, because your whole idea, for instance, we often speak about Vamana avatar, right, and Mahabali, who was very generous, right, and who was kind of kind in his own way. But even there is this paradox of how much more can you offer to me?
That's so wonderful.
Right. So that is the final kind of element of you face a dilemma, right? Even for Danveer Karan, right? When we talk about Danveer Karan, I mean, we have discussed about this in the last few episodes. I mean, the paradox of his nature and his being, essentially, and why he ended up on the wrong side of history for whatever reasons, is also to do with how he understood these constructs of what is non-dual, the truth of his life, the truth of his relations, for instance, right? And he didn't see it in a more scale-oriented way, I would say, right? He saw it in a very specific one-to-one Duryodhana Karna kind of framework, right? But it was not going beyond just that many a times, right? Even in the court, when the disrobing of Draupadi was happening, when the various other things happened, there were times when he did not quite realize it in its entirety, essentially. So that was a problem.
And as you explained in previous talks, that the Bhagavad Gita itself is Arjuna is questioning God.
Right. And Bhagavan, actually, even in Vedanta, I think, and we had mentioned this, that we have this active element of questioning, right? I mean, Swami Vivekananda, for instance, he was an extremely kind of rational person, so to say, right? I mean, and in fact, he was being that, however, he was very curious to know about the higher realities of nature, of the universe, for instance. And one of the questions he asked Ramakrishna Paramahamsa Thakur was that, can you show me God? Right?
Being questioned is not disrespect.
Right.
It's dharma.
Exactly. And then he kind of questioned vigorously, right, about that. And then he was given an experience, he was given a certain form of how to understand it, which was beyond rationality, so to say. And that's how he kind of finally went towards Thakur, right? So all these stories show us some beautiful aspects of duality and how we negotiate with that, essentially.
So, if you could more explain something from the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, how do the stories from the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara allow us to navigate the grey space beyond dualities?
Right. I mean, in that case, I think we have to talk about this aspect of, how you look at categories themselves, the moral categories, right? How you look at, how do you judge or understand a character in the stories, right? So, for instance, again, going back to the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, right? When Arjuna had this paralysis almost, right? We talk about policy paralysis. He had a moral paralysis of sorts, where he was like, what am I supposed to do, right? Mera dharm kehta hai that I have to go and fight them, right? But they are my relatives, right? So Shri Krishna doesn't quite resolve it using this element of saying that love trumps duty or duty trumps love, right? He doesn't do that. He goes beyond that. He transcends that. He talks about nishkama karma, right? The idea that of any kind of karma which doesn't quite have an attachment to the result as such, right? So this is very, very important, because the aspect of dynamic engagement, right, beyond oppositional thinking is something that Sri Krishna definitely talks about. Now, when Keikei, for instance, in the Ramayana, she asks for the two boons, right? She says that Ram has to go into exile and Bharat has to be the king, right? People would obviously think of it as either that she is a villain through and through, which she was not actually beyond a point, that they picture her, color her in that way, right? Now, the point is that in her action, right, it kind of kickstarted the entire Ramayana and the story of Sri Ram and the whole kind of yug dharm that was kind of almost changed or questioned fundamentally and confronted by Sri Ram in his confrontation with Ravan, for instance, right? Then Dashrath, Raja Dashrath, right? He also has this dilemma, right? He says that he's a very kind and loving father, but he's a just ruler as well, right? So which category do you put him into per se? Because there are these grey zones in that period. Even after that, when Sri Ram leaves, right, there are conversations that show that, right? So there is no clear-cut kind of black and white again in that perspective, right? So the duality aspect, how you think about it, is fundamentally very different from how you kind of understand it in the very binary way of thinking, so to say, right? Now, this is also seen in one very interesting context in the Tamil text Shilapati Karam, right? Where Ilango Adigal gives a narrative which deconstructs every moral certainty, so to say, right? So the story of Kovalan, right? Kovalan, who's a protagonist, and how the theft happens. There's a story of, accused of theft and is executed, so to say. It could have been a very pedantic, ye theek hai, ye theek nahi hai kind of a story, right? But it was not that, right? There were many other elements in it which are much more grayer in their own ways, right? So for instance, the king is kind of thinking of himself as dispenser of justice, right? The merchants who come out and complain are also thinking they are in the right in the way they are doing things, right? Even when we are talking about Kanagi, who is the lady whose rage burns entire Madurai, right, in the story itself. It could have been just a story of a righteous revenge of sorts, right? But it was looked at in a more cosmic way. It was looked at in a bigger kind of picture. And the way in which we position ourselves, how we understand what is coming out of that story, is often in those liminal or gray spaces, right? So this is very important to understand, that this narrative refuses to be categorized in moral categories, very simply put, right? And this is what anthropologist Victor Turner, he talks about when he says liminal situations, right? So when Yudhishthir has these moments of dilemma, right? When Bhagwan Hanuman kind of takes that leap, right? It's almost like a metaphorical leap between what is possible and what is not, right? Then even Draupadi's questions in the court, right? There are many very, very insightful, incisive questions that are raised at that point. They're all talking about these liminal situations, so to say, right? In the Mahabharata, for instance, again, Sri Krishna talking about Ashwathama iti Gaja, right? Why would he kind of do that? Right? There is a certain aspect of, again, non-absolutism, where you cannot quite abide with either side up to a certain point, beyond a certain point rather, when things are situated or contextualized in a specific scenario, right? So he shows that there is an element of transcending that happens from the right space though, right? Because I've seen many people who say that, "Arey, agar kuch bhi chalta hai, attitude rehta hai, rahega, reh sakta hai," then we should do anything and everything, right? But that is not the space from which Sri Krishna was talking about this, right? So this should not become an excuse to do those things which you think are convenient, basically, right? So now, if you talk about this technique, there are certain techniques used in these stories, right? These techniques are called narrative braiding, right? You braid like, women braid their hair, we braid ropes, for instance, the constants of the ropes. So the stories intertwine with each other, right? And they are very carefully intertwined with each other. They are entangled, almost, to use the quantum term there. And the reason for that is that you cannot make a stand, right? Because the moment you make a stand, there is another turn, the counter turn, so to say, of that braid, which does not allow you to do that. Right? So in Shilapati Karam, what do you want to kind of work with? Is it Kanagi's devotion? Is it Madhavi's artistic passion? Is it Kovalan's confused longing, right? Is it the king's administrative burdens, right? What are you relating to, and to what extent, right? So these are aspects which makes them these peaceful resolution zones, right? Which does not have any way to understand them beyond a point. Again, going back to the Mahabharata, you talk about Bhishma Pitama, right? When he's sleeping on the bed of arrows, it almost is like he's sleeping on the million sharp questions that life gives to you. Right? He's sleeping in that liminal space, that intermediate space between life and death. He's neither fully alive in the usual sense of the term, nor has he embraced death at that point, right? So in that, there is a lot of practical wisdom that he gives to Yudhishthir, right? He talks about a lot of aspects which actually creates the crux of the post-war kind of wisdom that goes forward, right? So there is a certain kind of negative capability, if you will, of looking at how uncertainties and these liminal spaces, these gray zones, actually can be fountainheads of knowledge, of wisdom, right? And Bhishma Pitama beautifully portrays that. So the deepest wisdom here may be that, there are actually these gray zones that are the fountainheads of creativity. Bharatiya Gyan Parampara has never spoken about the binaries as an absolute, right? And the dualities have to be looked at using this element of negotiating, and contextually negotiating what you bring out of it, right? How do you kind of understand the territory unfolded by these oppositional categories, essentially, right? And when you do that, then you get something much more fruitful, you get something much more enriching for humanity in large.
So as we are discussing about Mahabharata and the Sanskrit texts, so the concept of language, in the sense you talked about language as well, the duality in between the semantics of the languages. What about Sanskrit, sir?
Right. I mean, this question is very important because language has a lot to do with this concept of articulation, right? We had spoken in one of our previous interactions how nature articulates things in terms of mathematics, mathematical structures in many ways, or rather we do it in terms of mathematics. And so the question is whether this idea of binaries, right, or duality, is it nature which has it and language is articulating it? Or is it that language has it and therefore we are getting it from it, right? So whether we are deriving our understanding of the nature of reality from the tools that help us in describing it, right? So language, for instance. So this is a classic chicken and egg kind of problem, right?
I can remember
It's
that Mahavakya,
Yes.
Sabdrum.
Right, absolutely. So now, but however, research in cognitive science shows us that before language comes into a child's mind, right, when an infant is talking about different kinds of things relating to things in that sense, there is a certain presence of pre-linguistic understandings and categorical definitions that exist even before that, right? And there is something known as a violation of expectation experiment in the context of infants and children, where it is seen that if some things, if there is a stimulus, right, which is going against the elements of causality or things that the child thinks is expected in that scenario, there is a higher degree of attentiveness that goes into that, right? So they relate, they can understand, right? They can see what is the norm and what is the exception, right? So this idea and this duality here is something which even before language comes into the picture is seen, right? Now, however, the way we articulate it, it is seen that language subsequently helps us in encoding and decoding that very same thing. Those pre-linguistic constructs may have been there, but how do you understand it? How do you articulate it? That also further helps us in getting the essence of what we are seeing, essentially, right? And then there are things like symbolic reasoning, there are complex relational cognitions, for instance. They also help us in doing the same. Now, talking about Sanskrit, we have a lot of different elements of Sanskrit which are extremely useful. It's even fundamental, I would say, to this understanding of dualities and moving and transcending them as such, right? So one important thing, of course, is Sanskrit has a lot of different features, right, which are very important. And according to Ashtadhyay, right, we have these articulatory features, right? So some of the articulatory features are, for instance, voicing, right? How we voice, is it swara or is it anunasika? Right? So what is the form of the voicing? The breath amount, right? Whether it is alpa prana or mahaprana, which is basically articulated with a lot of breath involved in certain ways, or alpa prana means mild or not that much of breath being used all that much in that sense. Then there is another aspect of place of articulation, right? So for instance, is it kanthya or talavya, right? Which is basically talav we talk about, and kantha is your neck essentially. So where exactly is it kind of being articulated from, right? And then aspects of nasality, nasal aspects from the nose essentially. So each sound kind of has a relational way to define its identity, so to say, right? So the combinatorial and contrastive system helps us in understanding what is the difference between pa and ba and ka and ga, for instance, and so on, right? So this also reflects what Roman Jacobson, right, when he spoke about the theory of distinctive features, he also speaks about how these phonemes, right, these smaller units of sound are kind of differentiated among themselves, right? So the feature-based architecture is kind of helping us in not only encoding acoustic architectures, acoustics, the sound of it, but the degrees and spectrum of distinctiveness, right? And they are happening at a very, very foundational and fundamental level, right? So the way that Sanskrit helps us in that respect, I mean, there are a lot of different other languages also, I'll come back to Sanskrit in a bit, which also kind of gives us some insights into this. So for instance, in Russian, right, I was recently reading about a few of these languages, there is a distinguishing characteristic between what is a completed task and what is not a completed task, right? It's very interesting. So this temporal idea of completion is something which is hardwired in a manner of speaking in the language itself, right? So the duality of completion and being incomplete, essentially. In Japanese, for instance, we have different honorifics, how you politely, the degree of politeness, how you are addressing people, right? You versus them, right? Again, the mode of doing that, right? There are certain qualifying elements in Japanese, right? In Piraya language of Amazon, right? It's very interesting. The other side of it, there aren't words for many and few, right? These distinctions on the quantitative side, there are certain restrictions on that front. There aren't those words, essentially. And so one wonders, how do you even articulate that?
Yes.
Right? So there are certain ways that you do that, essentially, and contextually speaking. And again, on the flip side, you will see that in Garhwali language, right? I was recently, I heard about this. Even for bad odor, right? The smell, element of smell, they have about, I don't know, 15 to 19, 17 or 19 different words for the kinds of bad odors that you get from different sources, right? Okay. So if it is, I don't know, sewage, right? Or some other kind of source, there are different ways in which they kind of qualify that using the same, using just one word. It's not like when we say in English, we say a very, very bad odor, right? Or Jaghanna, we say Jaghanna, right? Jaghanna means absolute disgusting, essentially, right? In Bengali, Jaganno, smell. So the point is, they are not requiring anything else. They're not requiring qualifying words per se, right? So why is this important? Because it's not about whether you can construct these ideas of dualities in a bigger picture. It is about how concisely and how efficiently you can do it. Right? That is very important. So there is a very well-known kind of hypothesis called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which says that your language, right, articulates the ways of thinking as well. Right? So for instance, in this context, you would say that the particular binary categories depends or encoded in your native language influence which dualities you can relate or represent in your culture, right? Or in your civilization ethos. So going back now to Sanskrit.
I mean, more than 10 words maybe to describe Agni.
Right.
More than that to describe Surya.
Absolutely.
Light.
Absolutely.
And in fact, profoundly, give emphasis on something to do with light.
Yes. So even, in fact, for instance, Gamanam, I think I mentioned about this Gau and Gamanam, right? This movement, aspect of movement. I mean, there are so many ways you can kind of define that, and the poetic aspect of it, right? That brings in layers of meaning. Right? Which is so beautiful, right? So here, for instance, in India, in Bharat, we have had discussions of Nirguna and Saguna, Nirakar, Sakara. There are different binary categories that we have looked at in the past, right? And there are certain extensive case paradigms. There are certain kind of participial constructions, right? Which give us very efficient ways to encode. Right? This word called encoding. As I said, in Garhwali, you could have said the same thing in a number of different ways, but you had exactly the correct kind of attribution and articulation for it, right? Similarly, in Sanskrit, we have different elements which help us in doing that in a much more efficient manner, right? Which is why I see this as a feedback loop, right? The language is from the thought process, but the thought process is also by the language, and the articulation helps in terms of expanding forward, but that in turn helps the articulation. Right? So it is a continuous cycle of sorts, right? Which kind of is very important. So for instance, when Sri Adi Shankaracharya talks about the Sat and Asat aspect, right? He's expressing something much more than what we can relate to in everyday life necessarily. And many a times it is the sufficiency of the language or the rigor of that language, right? If you say Brahman, which is Anirvachaniya, right? Even in that we say Satchitananda. Right? So the first question that should come to mind, if it is anirvachaniya, then how are you talking about Satchitananda? Right? So there is definitely a degree of qualification, degree of description that does exist for Brahman per se. Right? So even at that level, I mean, even in modern attempts, we are looking at physics today, we don't have a way to describe not wave, not particle. Right? People say, what is it then? Right? Is it a wave-on? There is a theory, wave-on theory, and neither or, what is it? Right? So we are still struggling as it stands today, right, to describe many of these categorical, transcending kind of scenarios, essentially, right? Now, neurological kind of evidence also shows that certain areas of the brain, like Broca's and Wernicke's areas in our brain, which relates to, language processing, They are also active when you are thinking in certain ways, right? You are foundationally, abstract reasoning, for instance, or hierarchically structuring, points in your mind. There are ways in which it correlates, right? So we see that language and thinking, even at a very biological level, at a very fundamental level, there is a correlation that exists between the two, right? Now, however, we have seen that across the world, there are ways in which sustained attention practices has helped us in transcending the confines of the language, right? The confines of linguistic articulation itself, right? So, for instance, we can see language is both a constraint as well as a liberating tool as well, right? So, for instance, when we're talking about, there's a very interesting example. We were talking about poetry and double meaning or layered meaning. Kalidas's Meghadoot, right? When we talk about Kalidas's Meghadoot, there is a passage where there is an exiled yaksha, and he's looking at a cloud, right? And the cloud is a cloud, but it is also a messenger of sorts, right? So there's a dual aspect there. And there's a very beautiful shloka, which is verse 1.5, which says, Dhuma Jyotiha Salila Marutam Sanipata Kwa Megha Samdeshartha Kwa Patukaranai Pranibhi Prapanyah Ityotsukyad Aparaganayan Guhyakash Tamam Yayache Kamartahi Prakriti Kripanasha Chetana Chetaneshu, which means a cloud is but a mingling of smoke, fire, water and wind. How can it serve as a messenger, and how can words be carried without the skill of living beings? Yet, overcome with longing, the yaksha did not weigh such doubts, for those pierced by love, are by nature helpless, right? Whether dealing with the sentient or the insentient, right? So this tension doesn't quite weaken the poem, it actually reinforces it, right? It actually brings together these cosmic process and the human emotion in a very, very powerful way in which consciousness is expressed, right? So, and the key lies in linguistic sophistication, right? How do you become aware of the words that shape our world while simultaneously using the words to skillfully point to their own limitations, right? If you can reach that level of sophistication, then we are talking about what the seers, the luminaries of Bharat, right? They had always dealt with the words, but also looked at the limitations and gone beyond it. And over time, the language, and even before as well, because Sanskrit is called a mantric language, right? Mantras and the bij mantras, right, are very, very foundational, essentially, right? So even at that level, there is an element of transcending what it itself is representing. That's the beauty of it. That's the duality, the ultimate duality, right? You're articulating and at the same time transcending the articulation, right? And that is why I say that Sanskrit is such a powerful language, right? Because it is doing that dual aspect in real time, right? And that is what makes it so powerful in philosophical texts. And
complex but powerful.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So in complexity, science system can be both chaotic and ordered.
Yeah.
Do such third space dissolve the need? I mean, third space, you have to explain that.
Right, yeah.
Part
so,
also.
Absolutely. So I think
how they need of the duality.
Yeah. So I think the idea is that emergence and emergent domains, right? How things emerge from something more fundamental. Complexity science has been basically dealing with that, right? And this idea that how duality functions as a fundamental organizing kind of principle, so to say. So everything from neural networks, right? And there are certain other kind of climate change based complexity science dynamics, for instance. There are market dynamics, which we were talking about. They're all maintaining a certain kind of tension or a certain balance between structure and flexibility, right? There is a subtle balance between the two. And again, about what is articulated, what is not, right? What is the premise and what is the variation on that premise, right? These are aspects which there is a compromise between opposites, and that in turn helps the system itself in various ways, right? So phase transitions, for instance, we talk about phase transitions. In phase transitions, when we're talking about ice, liquid, solid, liquid, gas, and so on and so forth, plasma, BEC, then you have these ways to parameterize it. You have ways to kind of describe it, essentially. And sometimes you see that qualitatively new kinds of things come out of it, right? So for instance, scale invariance, right? Long range interactions. These are things that you may not immediately kind of foresee, or it may not be necessarily a part of the constituent elements that are creating that system, right? But in a certain emergent manner, when the phase transition actually happens, they do come about, essentially, right? So this is the organizational principle that I have been talking about. And Stuart Kaufman is a very well-known thinker and a person who has talked about this. He talks about autocatalytic sets, right? Autocatalytic sets, which this is in the context of biological systems, and it is seen that life emerges at the interface of order and disorder, right? It is kind of where molecular networks become sufficiently complex to analyze their own reproduction while remaining flexible enough to evolve, right? So there is this structure and flexibility. Again, that aspect comes into the picture. Now, the mathematics of complexity is quite involved, quite complicated in its own way. But there are some key elements that talk about this aspect of duality, right? So for instance, attractor dynamics is a certain term that is used, which is basically in the phase of a certain system, the state of the certain system, where does the system go towards, right? Attractor dynamics, we call it. And that always requires at least 2 dimensions to talk about it in the first place, right? There is always a need for multiple variables to talk about these elements of strange attractors. There are various terms that are used, bifurcations, limit cycles, for instance. These are only possible when there are multiple variables. Then there is something known as a Lorentz attractor, which is a beautiful butterfly-like kind of, shape that you get in the Lorentz system sometimes. And there, the nonlinear couplings between 3 variables, right? They kind of represent these convection patterns of sorts, right? And each variable maintains its identity while participating in this bigger kind of dynamic, so to say. Then you have something known as small world networks, where the localized and the globalized, right? The smaller kind of instance of local organization and the global organization coexist with each other, right? They have to work together. The nodes maintain a strong local neighborhood relationship, right? But the long range interactions, the connections also plays a big role, right? So then you have things like power law distributions, where again, these dualities exist in multiple scales, right? There are multiple scales of being, and there are certain connected hubs, right? These are like networks, right? So connected hubs, and there is a globalized kind of picture to it as well. So power law distributions again shows us dualities, so to say. Now emergence, this word emergence is very important, because now we are talking about cases where even space and time are emergent. We were discussing the other day as well, right? So how does the higher order property maintain its standing along with the unit that made it in the first place, right? I'll give an example. The flocks of birds, right? Flocks of birds, the way they organizationally move, right? There are certain distinctive behavioral aspects to them as individuals, but also as an ensemble, as a group, essentially. And there are many theories for it, like magnetoreception and so on and so forth. But the tension between the two things, right, often plays a big role, right? Because if you have an anomalous climate situation, let's say, right, or there is a certain kind of asymmetry in the flying pattern, there are many such scenarios that does affect how the birds as individuals and as a group react or behave, right? And this tension between the two aspects is very important when we talk about emergence, essentially, right? So, for instance, there are other models like sandpile models, right? There are certain models like when you have forest fires, right? When you have earthquake patterns, right? There are these things called avalanche patterns, which are formed at multiple scales, right? Again, the dualities across the scales, right? How the things are precipitated, how the complexity is defined in those systems, that is very, very important, essentially, right? So now in adaptive cycles in nature, we see that there is apparently a third space. We were talking about the third space. The third space is between the subcritical, the two-ordered, and supercritical or the two-chaotic, right? And that is where there are models like the Penarchy model that talks about systems moving through phases of growth, conservation, and release and renewal, right? So it happens in certain kind of cycles, so to say, right? And the system's resilience depends on the capacity to navigate these transitions, essentially, right? So in machine learning, for instance, we talk about machine learning. Nowadays, that's the big thing in many different areas. Now, that also talks about something known as productive dualities, productive dualities. So, for instance, an individual unit or a sub-network can have certain kinds of specialized feature sensitivities, right? But at the same time, the activations attribute themselves to some distributed behavior, right? Certain kinds of distributed higher dimensional representations, as it is called, right? And the network's abstraction and the flexibility, again, plays a big role in the way in which the machine learning model or the technique kind of develops and is utilized, essentially, right? Similarly, non-equilibrium thermodynamics, we were talking about thermodynamics, there are dissipative structures, right, which dissipate energy and various other ways of doing things. So Rayleigh-Bernard convection cells, right, and various other biological organisms in these, they have this ordered organization only by operating in a non-equilibrium regime where there is no equilibrium per se, right? And this continuous exchange of energy and matter that keeps on happening between the system and the environment, that plays a big role in how the system evolves and how the system is maintained, right? Again, the aspect of dualities, right? This existence depends fundamentally on the duality between system and environment. Not only that, between structure and flux, the exchange, right? So in Advaita, we talk about Vyavarika Satya. We had spoken about that as well. In the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara also, they saw the relevance of these kinds of dualities at an empirical level, at the level of how we relate to things at the worldly sense. So this complexity science and our Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, right, they show that emergent properties, right, they depend on but also transcend, right, these constituent dualities. Right, so there is a again that whole idea of composition and transcending at the same time, right? So we are almost talking about a meta duality, right? Duality that goes beyond just the very simple instance of duality as we
Vedic deities
like
as well. Agni, we consider it as a phenomena.
Exactly, but it is transcending that. So Agni can also be, as we were discussing previously as well, digestive systems and our body, the consciousness, the yagya of our consciousness. Right, the yagya that we actually have, right, and the yagya in the cosmic sense, right. So all of that encapsulates, but also transcends in that encapsulation, or post that encapsulation of sorts, right. So that is the beauty that we are talking about here, right. So now, rather than seeing this as tension, as contradiction, right, complexity science is talking about looking at this as coordination, as coming together, right, and as contextual negotiation of how these things build up, right, and lead to emergences that actually matter, essentially.
Wow. So right. I will end with this question, that if non-duality is the truth, why is duality so beautiful? I mean, in our context, maybe not everyone will but poetic and creatively generative.
Yes, I mean, I remember somebody was mentioning to me a few days back that this element of moksha, right, and an element of realization, when all the other things are no longer relevant beyond a point, from their kind of understanding of what they like and not like, they called it a very boring state. Okay, this is a very funny incident, very funny interaction, right? Because
the concept of you only live once,
right?
That is more boring,
right. So I mean, well, in the modern context, you have this YOLO, right? YOLO is what is called you only live once, right? That is boring as well, right? You know, you're categorizing it as something
absolutely boring,
absolutely boring in certain ways. But for that person, I mean, this idea of transcendence or self-realization was what they called as boring, quote unquote, right? So to go back to your question, I mean, this whole idea of what is interesting, right? What is colorful, what is diverse, right? In that, there is definitely an element of duality, right? So now, if there is beauty in that, if there is purpose that people find in that, right? How do we reconcile these two things, right? There is non-duality and there is duality. Duality has a beauty, has a certain purpose, has certain kind of contingent reality to it, realities to it, but non-duality is what we are saying, or our traditions as well as science is showing in many ways, is the underlying premise, right? So the question could also be, why the former at all, right?
Like the
why do we kind of
Shiv Shakti.
Shiv Shakti, and also about the Devtas, for instance, right? If Adi Shakti and Parama Shiva are the final reality, or Brahman is the final reality, right? The diversification even at the level of deities, right? Why? right? So that is a fundamental question that people talk about, right? And so in Advaita, we obviously talk about Maya, right? And there is a certain beginningless and endless kind of reality that superimposes, you could say, that's not the right way per se, but is very much there, essentially, right? So now, the question is the creative necessity for these distinctions, right? The creative necessity for apparent distinctions, as I call it. And in the Samkhya Karika, in the Spanda Karika, we have a place where it is said that Spanda, this element of Spanda, I think we had touched upon this in one of the previous instances in our discussions. So Spanda is this throb, this pulsation of consciousness, right? So in Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, Spanda is the creative kind of element that leads to all that we see in a certain manner of speaking, and that is what underlies the resolution of this paradox, right? So in the Spanda Karika, for instance, in verse 1.3, it says how Spanda is inherent in all the different instances of the diversity we see around us, right? In Kashmiri Shaivism itself, when we talk about there is this element of aesthetic rapture, right? In English, to use the word in English, aesthetic rapture, which means this joy, right? It is all the word used as chamatkar, right? When you see this beautiful diversity, right? And you realize that it doesn't arise despite non-duality, but it actually arises because of it, right? Now this point that you just said, which is that duality is beautiful, right? But in saying that, you're implying that non-duality is not beautiful in a certain way, right? Or you're not. Yeah,
it indicates
it could be, right? That there is something that is not part of it, essentially, and it may not be as beautiful as the dual part of it, right?
As Chaitanya Dev, come up with the Dvaita.
Right. But the point here is that in chamatkara or aesthetic rapture, it comes from a space of realization, right? And this beauty, this aesthetic aspect, is not despite of non-duality, but it is actually because of it, right? And this duality is a qualification of that non-duality, right? So that is the beauty. And when we say Abhinav Gupta, he talks about Acharya Abhinav Gupta, he talks about the rasa of adbhuta, right? The wonderment, essentially, right? Beauty emerges because there is this liminal space. This is this gray space where there are elements of recognition and mysticism, elements where you can understand and not understand, right? There are these beautiful interstices of reality, right? Where there is a lingering pause, right? And that is where this idea of Maya, which we talk about from Advaita, for instance, Sri Adi Shankaracharya's successor, one of the successors, Sureshwara, Acharya Sureshwara, he says that, Maya is not falsehood. Maya is not ignorance. People often mistake that as that, right? But Maya is this inexplicable capacity of Brahman, right? To appear as this multiplicity, right? To kind of, without actually becoming divided. Right? It appears as a multiplicity, but it is not getting divided per se, right? There is still Brahman as it is, right? We don't say there is Brahman 1, Brahman 2, and Brahman 3, right? Brahman is 1, right? Or it's rather not 2, right? As we call it, right? So the point is that in this aspect, this liminal space, right? We are moved because it points towards, sometimes if you think about it, the way we look at nature, the way we look at sceneries, right? The way we look at flowers, right? Art, for instance.
Like I heard somewhere about art and the beauty of the nature. The more prolonged the Fibonacci series in terms of Fibonacci series you find, the more beautiful it will be.
Right. Now, just to touch upon that, and also the golden ratio. We talk about the golden ratio, right? We see that recurring in many different places, right? In a seashell, in a flower, right? In many other places, right? In the windings of a galaxy, for instance, right? Now, when we see them, right, what we are actually doing in our mind, I mean, subconsciously almost, is we are relating to it, right? We are engaging at a very personal level with that, and in that relating, in that realization of whatever is connecting you to that thing, you are actually acknowledging the non-dual source, right? So even though you are actually appreciating the dual aspect, but the whole process of doing it is actually acknowledging the non-dual source, right? So this paradox is something that you again negotiate as you see beauty, right? And this is very beautiful because this is what, in the Rasa theory, in various other, this Adbhuta, Chamatkara, right? This tension, or I wouldn't say the tension, but a simultaneous existence of appreciating the emergent duality, the duality as it exists, and the source that may be non-dual. Right? This is seen in many different places, essentially. Right? Now, just to talk about certain kinds of cognitive neuroscience, right? And I'll go into a little bit of rigor here. The default mode network, right, which underpins the self-referential cognition and maintenance of ego, this idea of ego, exhibits dynamic functional coupling and decoupling with certain things called frontoparietal control networks, right, and salience networks. These are terms that are used, which are seen in episodes of peak aesthetic engagement, when you're engaging with something which is very aesthetically beautiful, for instance, right? And empirical investigations of these states, of flow states as it is called, when you're absorbed in aesthetics, for instance, right? When you're also, very interestingly, hedonic means not the very good type of experiences. Even in those extreme cases, it is seen that heightened aesthetic responsiveness, how you respond, right, is associated with certain transient reductions, right, in the subject-object differentiation. So you stop differentiating between the subject and the object in real time, right? As I said, that you start relating, you start engaging, right? And this is mediated by these attenuated DMNs, this default mode networks, essentially, activities, and coupled with certain kinds of attention-based scaffoldings, as we call it in technical terms, right? And so this aesthetic salience emerges from the difference between neural integration and segregation, right? Engagement and disengagement, duality and non-duality. So even at that level, there is a duality of sorts again, right? So it is again a meta-duality, so to say. Right? Now, there are certain kinds of oscillatory mechanisms, for instance, gamma band synchrony, theta gamma coupling, that also look at temporal binding of different kinds of neural structures, and they support this simultaneous experience of unity and multiplicity. Right? These are the technical ways in which we have understood now in today's context how you understand unity and disunity or multiplicity, so to say. Right? Now, if you talk about mathematics, right, you have something called as symmetry breaking, right? In symmetry breaking, there is another lens in which the forces of nature, right, they are seen to be arising from the same kind of underlying idea of things, right, with these small little parameters that change, so to say, right? And this is what is also seen in how we decide what kind of gauge theory we use in the context of some forces in nature, right? Now, how does it, again, going back to the Rasa theory, how does it relate to that, right? Where is this element of redundancy or subjectivity coming in, right? So there's a very interesting text, a work by Acharya Anandavardhana, right? He's a 9th century Kashmiri theorist, and he gives us the theory of Dhwani, right? Dhwani theory, which is a theory of poetic suggestion, essentially. And in the Dhwani theory, he talks about certain aspects of Rasa not being the content surface, but rather the suggested meaning that is present in the silences, in the pauses, right? For instance, he talks about separation, this element of separation, vipralambha shringara, which is basically the shringara or the rasa of love in separation. Right? So in that, for instance, you have many kinds of unspoken suggestions, right? The sighs that you have on stage, right? The imagery of moonlight behind a person, an actor, for instance, the trembling voice. These are all parts of an experience, right? And the rasa is something both personal and impersonal, right? It is something where the audience feels the ache of that longing, right? And it's not the words, it's not just the words, because if it were just the word, that would be a very dry way to understand love and separation. Correct. Right? It is about those interstices, those gaps between the words, right? And that is what makes this such a beautiful, suggestive resonance, right? We talk about resonance.
Difference between shallow and deep.
Right. And not only that, as I said, in art, when you're looking at some painting, for instance, it is all about, to use the physics word again, resonance, right? You resonate with something in that, right? And that is creating the most direct experience of non-duality, right? So while you're doing it at this dual aspect, you're doing it from a space of non-duality, and that is where the redundancy comes in, the aspect of redundancy, which is left like that, just like in symmetry breaking, for exactly the reason that you need to give that subjectivity to the experiencer, right? So now evolutionary aesthetics, for instance, does talk about identifying patterns that relate to good health, to certain kinds of harmonious aspects, right? Now this, we have seen that certain kinds of aesthetic sensitivity evolved to recognize these creative principles, right? So life actually comes from the interplay between order and complexity. They comes between unity and diversity, for instance. And there is also one very interesting thing that we see, that the most profound spiritual experiences often involve an intense stage of duality before we go to the non-duality. Okay, for instance, in Vipassana meditation, right, there are these points where it's there are some mental formations that are formed just before you go towards non-duality, right? In Zen experience, there is a concept called the great doubt before you reach the non-dual perspective. In Abrahamic religions as well, you talk about the dark night of the soul before you come to the final non-dual aspect, right? So all suggest that consciousness must sometimes amplify the dualistic aspect, right, before you go to the non-dualistic final destination.
Like, may I say,
yeah,
like, if we have to excel in Tantra,
yeah,
sadhana,
yes,
the threshold point is sub-sadhana.
Right. No, and not only that, the apparent separation is the means, the mode to reach that inseparable unity, right? And that is the paradox again, right? So while people think that they are doing mantra japa, for instance, right, they're doing karma yoga or jnana yoga, so yes, it's more kind of direct in certain ways, but other forms of yoga, right, which people, others, critics in modern context say ki iska kya fayda hai, right, what is the use of this, right? But while doing that quote unquote dual or certain kind of imminent ways to address non-duality or move towards non-duality,
how your nature
right,
resonate with
right,
which path?
So how do you resonate with it, right? And in that resonance, it's not about the act of the resonance or establishing the resonance, it's in the resonance itself that the non-duality is placed, right? So that subtlety is something very important to understand, essentially. And so there is also the tantric aspect, right? I mean, for instance, so before that, I mean, we have this thing called patterns that connect, right? Gregory Bateson was somebody who talked about this. So this pattern that connects to you or connects in general across scales, across phenomena, that is very important. That is the way in which duality actually converges to a non-duality, so to say, right? Now in tantric understanding, this is beautifully shown, right? This idea that recognition of consciousness in all its forms, right? So in the Kubjika Tantra, for instance, we have the goddess Kubjika, Ma Kubjika, and placed in the central channel of our body, the Sushumna Nadi, for instance, and there is a visualization, right? There are some petals, for instance, and there are some triangles and letters that we have, obviously, of the yantras, right? I mean, and the bij mantras that are associated with them, for instance, and they are very precise in their proportions, the sequences, and all that. But the text emphasizes that the aesthetic experience, right, it arises not from the external beauty, right, but it arises from recognizing that consciousness is implicit in every one of those elements, so to say, right? So that is this tension again is very well qualified in Tantra, and therefore in modern practice, I often see people misunderstanding Tantra quite a lot, right? They're using it for very, very frivolous reasons. They're portraying it in very frivolous ways, right? But Tantra, Mantra, Yantra, all these aspects, right, they are just these modes of duality at times which lead to the ultimate non-duality that we must move towards, right? So when you become absolute in those modes themselves, you just keep to that, then it becomes a problem, right? So for instance, there are certain aspects where we can say, so in all of this we can say that duality is basically like a pedagogical function that leads you to non-duality, essentially, right? So this self-discovery that we have, right, the deepest insight possibly is that we recognize how beauty, right, is how non-duality is implicit in beauty, right, in what we see in the diversity around us, right? And beauty is how non-duality experiences itself, right? Because if you are non-dual, if we are all non-dual, beauty is the way we are self-reflecting or reflecting on things that are emergent in a way, right? And duality is how non-duality appears to be at times, objectively speaking, right? So this element of beauty and objectivity, or subjectivity even, this is what is the central crux of wisdom when it comes to dualities, right? There is a direct revelation that the creative principle exists as both the cosmos and our capacity to appreciate it, right? Every moment of genuine aesthetic rapture, chamatkar, right, is a glimpse in this creativity of consciousness, right, which recognizes itself in the mirror of its own infinite expressions, right? So this tacit way in which there are different levels of dualities, right? Duality of the objective, the subjective as well, at the empirical level, right? The duality of the frameworks that describe it, and the duality even beyond that, and further, right? So it's almost ad infinitum, right? And so there's a multiplicity of dualities there, right? But at the end of that, right?
It's beautiful.
It is beautiful, right? And that beauty is probably non-dual, right? And that is where we have to understand that there is no tension. There is no this or that, even in that space. It is just all about reconciling that and understanding in terms of realization, essentially.
That's wonderful, sir. Thank you very much. And I like to end it with one thing that I remember right now. One novel I read a long time ago,
right,
of Bhutishon Bandyopadhyay's
right,
Debasidhyam.
Yes.
So I will not go into the details of that story.
Right.
There is two hermits
right,
from the Advaita
yes,
philosophy, and one is Advaita school.
Yes.
And they were, discussing about their philosophies.
Right.
And Advaitavadi is saying to the Dvaitavadi is saying to the Advaitavadi,
right,
that you are niras. So you are out of rasa.
Right. So I mean, for instance, even in Thakur's case, Sri Ramakrishna Paramhamsa's case, his guru, Totapuri Maharaj, he was a through and through Advaitin, right? And there is a story, I mean, I think we had discussed in one of the previous interactions, where he is like, what is with this Devi worship that you do, right? Ki korcho tumi, what are you doing, right? So Sri Ramakrishna doesn't say much, right? But then there is this episode where Totapuri has a certain kind of bout of rashes or some kind of, affliction, physically speaking. And then Sri Ramakrishna says that, well, Devi is also a part of that non-duality you talk about, right? And my mode of relating to that, my mode of understanding, accessing that, right? And being one in that, essentially, is what I do. Right? So I don't see an irreconcilable difference. I don't see something which is at odds with each other, essentially.
Like how it will feel like if you see yourself in your lover.
Right, absolutely. So you, again, the idea of resonance, right? You see yourself in the other,
yes,
right? And that union creates the beauty, essentially.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us today, and stay tuned for further episodes. Thank you.